Section 29 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 2. Penalties according to criminal anthropology. Fines, probation system, insane asylums, institutions for the incorrigible, capital punishment. Subchapter 210. Of all the criticisms raised by punishment, the most important is surely that which concerns its application, especially since the fruitful labours of Ferri, Garofalo, Van Amel, Viazzi, and Seguiel have not only corrected what there was irrational about the repression, but have brought into harmony with our juridical ideas. Now, when once it has been demonstrated that the penalty is not equivalent of compensation to offend society, or a sort of excommunication inflicted by lay priests with more thought of the crime than of the criminal, we see that punishment must change its character. We must have in view the welfare of society more than the punishment of the criminal, and the criminal and his victim more than the crime. The fear inspired by a man who suddenly commits a murder for a question of honour or for a political idea is very different from the fear we have of a man who puts a climax on a life of crime with an assassination for the purpose of theft or rape. In the first case, the punishment is almost useless, the crime itself being so grave a punishment that it is certain the offender will never repeat it. In the second case, every delay and every mitigation of the penalty is a peril of honest men. Thus, in case of assault, it is absurd to establish, as the codes do, a great differentiation according to the seriousness and duration of the effects, especially since antiseptic methods now hasten the cure. For the murderer does not measure his blows, and it is only purely by chance if they are not mortal. On the contrary, in crimes of this kind we must observe carefully to see whether the guilty person is a respectable man and whether he had serious provocation. If this is the case, he belongs in the category of criminals of passion, while the crime has a slight motive or has been premeditated with accomplices, and the persons in question are habitual criminals. The slightest assault, the unsuccessful attempt, ought to be punished as a serious crime in order to prevent fatal relapses into crime. In this case we ought to take no account of the quarrel of the two parties, who are not at all interested in what happened to others, for the state has the general welfare to care for. It is impossible, says Ferri, very rightly, to separate the crime from the criminal, as it is impossible, in drawing up penal code, to suppose an average criminal type, which in reality one never meets in any case. Now what does the judge do? Before him is a pair of scales. In one of the pans he puts the crime, in the other the penalty. He hesitates, then diminishes one side and adds to the other, expecting thus to measure the social adaptability of the criminal. But having once pronounced the sentence, the judge does not concern himself to know whether the person condemned falls again into the same crime. What does he know of the application of the penalty, and of the effect that it has upon the criminal to be deprived of his liberty? Further, when a criminal is sentenced to 20 years, but reformed in 10, why keep him there for 10 years longer, when another, termed it will be useful to remain in prison longer, is liberated at the end of 5 years? Crime is like sickness. The remedy should be fitted to the disease. It is the task of the criminal anthropologist to determine in what measure it should be applied. Or what should we say of a physician who stopped at the door of a hospital ward, should say to the patients brought him in, pneumonia, syrup of rhubarb for 15 days, typhus, syrup of rhubarb for a month, and then, at the end of the time named, turn them out of doors, cured or not. In order to avoid these faults, the penalty should be indeterminate, and should be subdivided according to the principle of Cicero, a natura hominis descenda est natura juris. We must make a difference according to whether we have under our eyes a born criminal, an occasional criminal, or a criminal by passion. In the case of every criminal, in whose case the crime itself and the personal conditions show that reparation of the damage is not a sufficient social sanction, the judge should give sentence of imprisonment for an indeterminate crime in a criminal asylum, or in the institutions, agricultural colonies or prisons, for occasional criminals, adults or minors. The carrying out of the sentence should be regarded as a logical and natural continuation of the work of the judge, as a function of practical protection on the part of special organs, The commission for carrying out penal sentences should include expert criminal anthropologists representing the judge, the defense, and the prosecution. These men, together with administrative officers, would stand not for neglecting and for getting the prisoner as soon as sentence is pronounced, as happens now, but for humanitarian work which would be efficacious for the protection, now of society against the liberation of dangerous criminals, now of the individual against the execution of a sentence which, in his case, has been proved to be excessive. It is apparent, then, that continual liberation is bound up with the principle of the indeterminate sentence. Subchapter 211. Penalties other than imprisonment. We ought as much as possible to avoid the short and repeated sentences to prison, which, as we have seen, is a school of crime, and especially of associated crime, the most dangerous of all. They prevent any cure, and render impossible any continuous effort, and they give the criminal a sort of distinction, for there are many prisoners who mark on their caps the number of their sentences. We might say, writes Crone, that most countries have adopted the principle of sending to prison as many men as possible, as often as possible, and for as short a period as possible. He might have added that they do this in a way to make the prison do as little good as possible, and as much harm as possible. I have seen in prison 11 children arrested under the very grave charge of being a band of malefactors for having stolen a herring, and 4 others who had stolen a bunch of grapes. At the same time, 3 ministers in the legislative chamber were defending a thief who had stolen 20 millions. According to Joly, there have almost always been in France as many as 3 million men who have passed at least 24 hours in prison. Each year, more than 100,000 individuals step in to keep up or raise this formidable number by taking the place of those who die. Berenger reckons that the isolation, and we may add, the imprisonment, of half the persons sentenced might be dispensed with. Of 300,000 persons convicted, 57,000 were for violation of police ordinances, etc. 7,000 or 8,000 prison for debt, 5,500 foreigners expelled from the country, and 13,000 or 14,000 awaiting transfer, and 12,000 serving sentences of less than 6 days. The short sentences, almost always served in company with habitual criminals, can have no intimidating effect, especially with the ridiculously short sentences of 1 and 3 days possible under the penal codes of Holland and Italy. The effects, on the contrary, are disastrous, since they make it impossible for justice to be taken seriously. By taking away all fear from the minds of the persons convicted, they drive them irresistibly to new offences on account of the dishonour already incurred. Accordingly, other repressive measures must be substituted for imprisonment for minor offences, such as confinement at home, security for good behaviour, judicial admonition, fines, forced labour without imprisonment, local exile, corporal punishment, and conditional sentence. Let us look into these new means. Subchapter 212. Corporal punishment, confinement at home. Corporal punishment for minor offences would be an excellent substitute for imprisonment if applied in a manner in harmony with our civilization. Fasting, the douche, and hard labour would be incontestably very efficacious, and at the same time less costly and easier to apply in varying degrees. In England, whipping has been reintroduced, and according to Tissot, with success. No less useful would be the confinement of the guilty person in his own home, a measure already employed in the army. Subchapter 213. Fines. After corporal punishment, the penalty which is most easily adjusted and most efficacious, provided it is guaranteed by bond, is a fine. Applied in proportion to the wealth of the culprit, it will contribute to diminish the enormous judicial expenses while striking the criminal rich, who escape punishment most easily on their most valuable side, the side from which they are most often impelled toward evil. Bonfils de Marsigny truly remarks that a fine is the most liberal, the most divisible, and the most economical, the most completely remissible punishment, and therefore the most efficacious. The more we advance, he says, the more value money has in this sense, since the number of pleasures it can buy becomes illimitable. Further, the number of those who use money for pleasure increases also, so that the more we advance, the more useful the fine becomes. Fines ought always to be employed for the punishment of those guilty of minor offences, thus diminishing greatly the number of imprisonments. According to the Code of Criminal Procedure in Holland, proceedings against a person guilty of a misdemeanour are not begun if the offender on being called is willing to pay the maximum fine. The case goes on only in the event of refusal to pay. For offences for which the penalty would be not more than a month's imprisonment, this function could be exercised by the Chamber of Advice, which could stop the proceedings upon the payment of a fine by the defendant. Those who refused to pay would be sentenced to labour, and if they refused to submit to this, they would have to serve a prison sentence made as severe as was consistent with health and life. As for the objection that the fine is difficult to proportion, it is not deserved to be taken seriously, for while a rich man does not care as little for 1 day in prison as a vagrant does, a fine of 10,000 francs from him would be the equivalent of a few francs from a poor man. Subchapter 214. Indemnity. A fine permits also the indemnifying of the victim, and in this way we strike at the root of crime, so much the more since the greatest number of criminals from cupidity are drawn from the professional and other well-to-do classes. The penal judges themselves should be obliged to fix the amount of damages to be paid, in order to avoid the delay and discomfort of a new trial in the civil court, and the public prosecutor, by virtue of his office, should call for the fixing of damages in cases where, whether through ignorance or fear, the victims take no action. Bonneville de Marsigny proposes to grant the victim a special lien upon the property of the convicted person. The indemnity should be collected by the state along with the expenses of the trial, and if necessary, a part of the returns of the prisoner's labour should be retained in favour of the victim. Subchapter 215. Reprimand and security. The judicial reprimand as substitute for punishment in the case of minor offences is already admitted in the codes of Italy, Russia, Spain, and Portugal, also in the Canton of Vaud and the Roman law which prescribed Monit lex antiquam ponet. However, if admonition can be efficacious in cases of the pranks of the young, brawls, and insults, it is not serious enough for the offences of criminal law to that security, which is really a suspended fine. The magistrate obliges the culprit to deposit a sum of money which shall guarantee society against his relapse. The deposit is made for a definite time, after which is restored to him if his conduct has been irreprehensible. This practice is allowed in the United States and in Denmark, and it is certain that the obligation to deposit a sum of money and the fear of losing it in case of relapse are much more effective in preventing rioting or violence than a few days in prison. The security for good conduct is no less useful when a magistrate in place of inflicting punishment demands of the defendant a guarantee that he will not disturb the peace of another, or that he will maintain good conduct, or abstain from certain definite acts. He warns him that in case of a new offence he will be subjected to more serious penalty than would have been inflicted for the first transgression. This measure has been adopted into the Spanish Code, and in England it has been in operation from early times under the form of reconnaissances to keep the peace, and of good behaviour demanded by the justice of the peace from bad characters, or from a person who has threatened another, always upon the demand of the person threatened, supported by evidence. The same method has been authorised since 1861 as an accessory penalty in convictions for crime. Subchapter 216. Probation System, Conditional Sentence. The best preventative institution for minor or occasional criminals is a probation system, widely used in the United States, especially for young criminals. A young criminal, not a recidivist, is not put into prison, but receives an admonition from the judge who warns him that the first relapse he will be sentenced, and he is placed under the surveillance of a special officer of the state. If this officer finds that in his family he is not receiving a proper education or sufficient oversight, he is put into a special home for neglected children. If he commits a fresh offence, he is again brought before the court and is sent to a reform school. This system has given such excellent results in Massachusetts that the idea was suggested for extending it to adult criminals, and the law of 1878 instituted a special official, the probation officer. This officer is supposed to inform himself with regard to all persons convicted of misdemeanors by the courts of Boston, and to determine, by the aid of the information received, whether the offenders are capable of being reformed without the need of the infliction of a penalty. He is present at the trials of all those for whom repressive measures do not seem to be necessary. after having made known the results of his investigations, of which the principal aim is to discover whether there has been a previous conviction, he asks that the culprit be released on probation. If the court consents to this, the culprit is put on probation for a period which may vary from 2 months to 12 under conditions imposed by the court. The probation officer formally undertakes to see that the conditions are carried out and has the right at any time during the period of probation to arrest the culprit for any case whatsoever and to bring him before the court again in order to have him undergo a sentence which had been suspended. When the term of probation has expired, the probation officer asks that the sentence be annulled, but in certain cases he may ask that the time first fixed be prolonged. The number of persons released on probation in the city of Boston guilty of drunkenness, receiving stolen goods, petite larceny, and assault and battery reached 2,803 during the period from 1879 to 1883. Of these, 223 did not conduct themselves properly during the term of their probation, were brought to court again and had to undergo the penalty. 44 took flight and could not be apprehended. In 1888, out of 244 persons put upon probation, 230 appeared to be reformed. Many of these promises, without doubt, have not been kept, but on the whole the desired effect seems really to have been attained. The officer declared that nearly 95% of the persons under his charge the previous year had maintained good conduct and had been released. Only 13, recognised as incorrigible, had had to undergo punishment. The experiment has been so successful that the law of 1880 extended the application of it to the whole state of Massachusetts. An analytical system was put into operation in England by the Probation of First Offenders Act of 1887, but while in America the concurrence and cooperation of the probation officer guaranteed the good conduct of the culprit, in England the pledge of the offender himself is required, or at least the concurrence of a bondsman whose assistance will be the most efficacious, since he is stimulated by the thought that a fresh offence will forfeit the bond. Further, the English law demands special grounds for release on probation and allows the magistrate to fix the time without the intervention of any special officer. According to a letter of Colonel Howard published by Professor von Litz, the number of persons continually released between 1887 and 1897 reached 20,000, with 9% of recidivisms. In Belgium, this institution, introduced by law in 1888, bore immediate fruit. The Minister of Justice reported to the Chamber in 1891 that of 449,070 persons convicted, 27,564 were conditionally released and only 2% relapsed into crime. These persons admitted to probation had been convicted for damage to property, blackmail, fraud, breach of trust, defamation of character, seduction of minors, marriage, brokage, indecent exposure, thefts, adulteration, unintentional injuries, approbation of lost objects, mendicity, vagabondage, the carrying and sale of forbidden weapons, unintentional homicides, kidnapping, attempted rape, arson, and fraudulent bankruptcy. The crimes handled in this fashion, then, were mostly those that are committed by occasional offenders, and only a few such as born criminals commit. In France also this new institution has been tried since the passage of the Berenguer Law in 1891. M. Dumas, Director of Penal Affairs, reported in 1893 upon the first 9 months' experience with the law. The correctional tribunals have pronounced 11,768 conditional sentences, of which 7,362 were for imprisonment and 4,406 were fines. This is out of a total of 162,582, of which 97,245 were prison sentences and 15,337 were fines. Hence the sentences suspended represented 7.5% of the prison sentences and 6.7% of the fines. In New Zealand and Australia, in the first period of 2 years, according to the report of the Minister of Justice, the results of the experiment were excellent. Of 121 persons admitted to probation, 58 had conducted themselves properly, 9 had not fulfilled the obligations imposed, 1 had taken flight, and 53 were still in a state of probation at the end of the second year. From the 1st of October 1886 to the 31st of December 1888, in New Zealand, according to the report of Captain Hume, sentence was suspended and replaced by probation for 203 persons, of whom 70% appeared to be reformed and 5% were arrested again. Subchapter 217. The Reformatory at Elmira. Another method of applying the principle of which we have been speaking is found in the Elmira Reformatory, which was created by Brockway under the inspiration of my Homme Criminel, as he himself says, and of which Winter, Way, and Ellis have given good descriptions. To this establishment are regularly sent only young men between 16 and 30 years of age, guilty for the first time of a minor offence. The law grants unlimited authority to the board of directors, who may set the prisoners at liberty at any time before the expiration of the sentence. The liberation is to be based upon a strong conviction that the culprit is reformed. The only formality which accompanies it is the word of honour that he gives the superintendent. However, though the board can shorten the sentence for the better prisoners, it cannot lengthen it for the others. Brockway concentrates all his efforts upon gaining a knowledge of the young criminal, of his psychological conditions, of the environment in which he has lived, and of the causes which have contributed to debase him. From these he deduces the means to bring about his reformation. He sets himself to develop the criminal's muscular system by douches, massage, gymnastics, and by a proper dietary, and to strengthen his will by making him take part in procuring his own liberation. Immediately upon arriving at the prison, the prisoner takes a bath, is then clothed in the uniform of the prison, is photographed, examined, and vaccinated. For 2 days he is shut up in his cell to meditate upon his crime and to prepare himself for reformation. The 3rd day he is brought before the superintendent, who places him, according to his tendencies and schooling, in a school or industrial class, and he is made to understand his duties and the conditions upon which he may regain his liberty. He is instructed in a trade, more than 75% of the prisoners know none, which shall permit him to earn his living after his liberation. This is the first care of the management. The young prisoners are divided into 3 classes, the good, the medium, and the bad or least corrigible. Each prisoner is marked monthly according to conduct, work, and progress in school, with a maximum of 3 for each, and to pass to the highest class he must obtain the maximum of 9 marks each month for 6 months. Promotion to the first class carries with it certain advantages, especially with regard to correspondence, such as receiving visits, having books, and eating at a common table instead of in a separate cell. Finally, the better prisoners are permitted to take walks together in the field, and responsible tasks are given to them, such as superintendence of the other prisoners. But just as they may win a place in the first class, so by negligence or bad conduct they may fall out of it. In this case they are put back into the 3rd class, and must submit to harder work in order to regain their position. Brockway, taking account of the aptitude and physical strength of each prisoner, fixed at the beginning of each month the amount of work that he must accomplish in order to obtain the maximum number of good marks. Each week there is published in the reformatory the summary, a paper conducted exclusively by the prisoners themselves. It contains a review of the political events of the week, taken from the better American newspapers. In addition, there are items with regard to the life of the institution itself, lectures that have been held, promotions and degradations, and the liberation of prisoners. I have been receiving this paper for a year, and find that no justice or Italy or France is so rich in news, and especially in information as regards criminality. All the work of the institution, even to the superintendence and guarding, is done by the prisoners themselves, so the expense is reduced to a minimum. At the same time, the work of the prisoners is chosen with a view to fitting them for life in society and not to making the institution pay a profit. The prisoners in first class are intentionally exposed to various kinds of temptations. After 6 months, Brockway proposes to the board that they be given conditional liberty. The board has a right to refuse permission, but as a matter of fact always authorises their liberation when Brockway considers it advisable. The release takes place, however, only after permanent employment has been found for the prisoner. After being liberated, he must give account of himself regularly for the first 6 months at least, and receive complete liberty only at the end of a year of good conduct. This is, then, the probation system perfected. No one is a warmer partisan than I myself of this reform, which is the first practical application of my studies. I believe firmly that the individual and physical study of each criminal, with practical, individualized instruction, can but have excellent results when applied to criminaloids. In these it will increase especially the habit of working. But for born criminals, this method does not seem to me equally efficacious. When I see that 49% of the inmates of the Elmira Reformatory are completely lacking in moral sensibility, that 12% have left home before they were 14 years old, that 37% come from drunken or epileptic parents, and that 56% show no signs of repentance, I do not believe that they can be reformed by hot and cold baths, great activity, and a sound education. I feel this the more since the promising children are there in limited numbers and are mingled with the adults. In fact, if we examine the detailed statistics of 1,722 prisoners set at liberty after remaining at Elmira for an average of 20 months, we find that 156 are settled in the other states, 10 are dead, 128 have not yet finished the term of their probation, 185 cannot be liberated until the expiration of their full sentence, 271 have been given partial liberty after having completed 6 months probation satisfactorily, 47% were arrested for other offences during the time of their probation, 126 did not furnish the reports required and disappeared. 79 have had to be returned to the reformatory. 25 returned voluntarily, having lost their employment. Leaving out the 10 who died, we have 533 who were not reformed. This is to say 31%, a proportion closely approaching that which I have given for born criminals. Moreover, the supervision of the individuals under probation is so superficial that if we count as recidivists those who have been lost sight of, we shall approach much more nearly to the reality than if we presume that they are reformed as Brockway does. But notwithstanding these defects, this system, together with the agricultural colony system, is the best possible substitute for the prison. Subchapter 218. Asylums for the Criminal Insane. There is another institution which we believe destined to promote harmony between humanitarian impulses and the safety of society, namely asylums for the criminal insane. We might argue indefinitely upon the abstract theory of punishment, but the whole world has agreed upon one point, that among real or supposed criminals there are many who are insane. For these, prison is an injustice and liberty a danger to which in Italy we have opposed only half measures, such as violate both morality and the social safety. The English who have arrived at reforms by the practice of true liberty have been trying for a century to fill up this most dangerous gap in the social structure, and have in large measure succeeded through the institution of asylums for the criminal insane. Beginning with 1786, dangerous lunatics were confined in a special ward in Beltlam, for which they could not be released except by the authority of the Lord Chancellor. In 1844, this measure appeared to be insufficient, and the state resolved to confine 235 of the criminal insane in the private institution of Fisherton House. But the number of these unfortunates increased continually, and special institutions were finally erected at Dundrum in Ireland in 1850, at Perth in Scotland in 1858, and at Broadmoor in England in 1863. New laws ordered that not only should those be received there who had committed a crime in a state of insanity, or had become insane during their trial, but also all prisoners who, whether from insanity or from idiocy, were incapable of undergoing prison discipline. These last are separated from the others and placed in particular sections. If cured, they are returned to prison, and others remain in prison as long as a royal order does not authorize their release. The number of these criminal maniacs in 1868 was 1,244. The character of the attendants, the attraction to the comfort of the inmates, and the arrangement for their employment and entertainment are all excellent. Yet many English philanthropists think they have not yet done enough, and complain that there are many persons in the ordinary prisons who should be confined in these asylums instead. In America, there are similar institutions, including an annex to the great penitentiary at Auburn. Now I ask myself, is it possible that institution which has been found useful by the most oligarchical nation in the world, and also by the most democratic, which in 24 years has been so greatly extended without yet fully meeting the demands upon it? Is it possible that this is a mere luxury, a caprice of Anglo-Saxon race? Does it not rather correspond to a sad social need, and ought not we, here in Italy, desire to see it take root and spread abroad in our land? If in Italy and in France the number of the criminal insane appears to be much smaller, This is because the public mind has not yet grasped the fact that a great number of criminal acts proceed from morbid impulses. If at times insanity is recognized as the sole cause of a crime and the trial is stopped, the authorities do not concern themselves further. Besides, many of these unfortunates have periods of rationality in the midst of their insanity, and are supposed on this account to be merely feigning. From another point of view, the presence of these unfortunates in penal institutions is an offence to the moral sense, and is not without danger both for society and for discipline. They can neither be cared for nor washed properly because of lack of fit quarters and of suitable organization. Further, they often act violently without sense of shame towards the other prisoners, and are so much more dangerous since they have sudden fits of excitement, often for the most trivial reasons. Thus, an insane prisoner killed another of the convicts because he would not black his shoes for him. At the same time, they obstinately resist the prison discipline, show themselves indifferent to punishment, discontented and defiant, and make themselves the centre of the pretext of continual insurrections. If they are kept isolated and chained in cells, as is too largely the custom, inaction and insufficient food and light soon make them the prey of disease, even if they do not themselves put an end to their unhappy existence. On the other hand, to send them to ordinary insane asylums gives rise to other inconveniences. They take their vices with them and become the disseminators of sodomy, flight, rebellion, and theft, to the detriment of the institutions and of the other patients, who are terrified by their savage and obscene manners and by the unhappy reputation that has preceded them. There is another class of the insane who, at a certain period of their lives, have been victims of a criminal impulse. These have not the depraved tendencies of the first class, but they are not less dangerous, for they are often irresistibly driven to savage and obscene acts. They wound persons and burn buildings, surmounting with remarkable clearness of mind all the obstacles that oppose them. These are those of them who feign the most perfect tranquillity in order to obtain their liberty, or to combine secretly for an escape or a plot. They do not avoid society as other insane persons do, but tend to associate among themselves, and as they preserve the restlessness of mind that they had before they became criminal or insane, they continually imagine that they are maltreated or insulted, and succeed in inspiring others with their false ideas and in giving form little by little to plans of flight or rebellion. This again differentiates them from ordinary lunatics, who are quite incapable of such enterprises, but like somnambulists, live isolated in an imaginary world. All alienists are in agreement as to these facts, and I myself have had direct proof of them in the institutions of which I have been director. Thus ere an insane person already in prison for receiving stolen goods complained incessantly of the injustice of the courts and of our treatment of him, which he did not find sufficiently respectful. He wrote absurd letters of protest to the king and to the prefect. One day he appeared entirely changed. He had become humbled and well-behaved. He had set himself to plotting with 3 other parties for a slaughter of the attendants, and a little later, while the attendants were engaged in distributing the soup at noon, he and his companions tore up part of the paving of the court and began to throw the stones in all directions. A few years later, an epileptic homicide did the same thing and nearly succeeded in putting the whole force of attendants to flight. Another insane criminal, a homicide with hallucinations, was so intelligent that although he was a poor shoemaker without education, he was able to write his autobiography in a style worthy of Cellini. This man conducted himself properly for 2 years, but one day there was discovered hidden in his bed a bar of iron which he had prepared for the express purpose of striking myself. Another day, having made a picklock of some pieces of wood, he opened 2 doors, let himself down from a window, and escaped. All instigators who have treated of this subject give examples of the danger of unexpected relapse into morbid tendencies on the part of individuals apparently harmless. The burgomaster of Graz some years ago became the victim of a religious monomaniac who had already threatened the life of another person. Hatfield, before making his attempt upon the life of George III, had attempted to kill his wife and 3 children. Confined in Bedlam, he there killed an insane person. Booth, the assassin of Lincoln, had once thrown himself into the sea, to speak, as he said, with a colleague who had drowned himself. The harm of the unrestrained liberty given to insane criminals ends by extending itself to the whole nation. This is not simply because these unfortunates turn their homicidal thoughts towards the heads of the nation, but especially because, being endowed with a very clear mind and a tendency to form associations, they succeed, when the moment is favourable, in forming a partisan band. This is the more dangerous because the leaders, lacking balance of mind, are unable to control themselves, but act upon the mind of the mob by the very fascination of their strangeness, and succeed in drawing them blindly after them. They are, we might say, firmament gems, powerless by themselves, but terrible in their effects when they can act at a given temperature and upon predisposed organism. Historic examples of this are to be found among the epidemics of insanity in the Middle Ages, among the Mormons and Methodists in America, in the incendiaries of Normandy in 1830, and in those of the Commune in Paris. We know now that, leaving aside the influence of certain rare idealists, the Commune was the effect of an epidemic delirium called forth by defeat and the abuse of absinthe, but especially by the great number of the insane, ambitious, homicidal, or even paralytic, freed too soon from the asylums, who, finding in this overexcited population a propitious soil, united and put into action their disastrous dreams. Laborde cites at least 8 members of the Commune who were notoriously insane, such as Eudes, Ferre, Goupil, Lunier, and Florenz, and such was B, who nevertheless was elected by 10,000 votes. The horrors of the French Revolution also were often provoked by the delirium of homicidal maniacs like Marat and Terriogny. The Marquis de Sade was president of the section of the pikemen. The only remedy for all these evils is unquestionably the institution of asylums for the criminal insane. If these received legal recognition and their position were unequivocally fixed, the continual conflict between justice and public safety would cease, a conflict which now is renewed every time one of these unfortunates comes to trial and an attempt is made to determine how far he was driven by morbid impulses and how far by the perversity of his own will. In doubt, the judges extricate themselves, now by injustice, now by imprudence, and later when they lighten the sentence of a man who appears insane, or acquits him altogether. The former when, as alas, too often happens, they condemn, perhaps to death, one whom an alienist would recognize at once as insane. Many will object, it is true, that we allow ourselves to be led by these considerations, which will end by punishing no one. But the same objections were raised against those who opposed the burning of those insane unfortunates whom men called witches. This position should not be ascribed to a sentimental pity, dangerous to others, for the measure is preventive even more than humanitarian. Since if those unjustly convicted are numerous, those imprudently acquitted are not less so. The thing to be done then is to prevent them from returning to society, to which they are a great source of danger, until we have every assurance that they have become perfectly harmless. It may be objected again that it is easier to confuse those who feign insanity with those who are really insane, and in fact, the number of these is very great among criminals. But the most recent studies have shown us that mistakes are made only because so many observers are ignorant of the connection between moral insanity and crime, and because, moreover, it is very difficult to make a true diagnosis, since many of the persons pretending insanity are really predisposed to it, so that in a short time they become actually insane, or are genuine insane persons who, ignorant of their true disease, easily pretend an artificial one. Further, these patients often present very rare forms of mental disturbance, and on this account the distrust of the physician is quite rightly aroused. Jacobi tells that he had to change his opinion 4 times about an insane person who appeared to be feigning insanity, but proved to be really insane. A thief who was pronounced by Delbruck to be feigning insanity starved himself to death. Another pretended that he had in his right leg a disease that he had in reality in his left. A homicidal monomaniac imitated in prison a form of insanity which he did not have, and did this, as he told me, to escape sentence. But if some criminals really succeed in feigning insanity, the perpetual seclusion in a hospital for the insane will be punishment enough, even if modern society, not content with defending itself against them, still wishes to revenge itself upon them. Insane criminals, in fact, complain incessantly of being kept in the hospitals, and demand without cries to return to prison. There is, for example, the case of Trocerello, who would not be allowed his counsel to defend him as insane, preferring to be executed to being immured in an insane asylum. Would not the asylum for the criminal insane be the best means of making such criminals harmless? I do not know whether Ezechia merely pretended to be insane, or was really so, but if he had been permanently confined in an insane asylum, the lives of several men would have been spared. Weidmeister objects, further, that the asylums for the criminal insane in England are often the theatre of sad scenes of blood, and require for their maintenance 3 times the expense of the others. This is true for the tendency to make plots. Very rarely in the ordinary asylums is, on the contrary, very frequent in the criminal asylums, since inmates know that they will never be released, and furthermore, being conscious of their impunity, destroy clothing and utensils, attack the attendants, wound and kill. In 1868, there occurred at Broadmoor 72 cases of which attendants were injured, 2 of them very seriously, and the daily expense especially great because the damage done by the insane and the high pay given the attendants reached 5 francs for each insane person. There is nothing, however, to wonder at in that, or should it cause any serious opposition, for it is natural that the bringing together of so many dangerous individuals should bring great dangers with it, especially to the poor attendants, who, notwithstanding the high wages, seldom remain long in the service. But if it were not for the asylums for the criminal insane, these things would occur in the ordinary asylums. Besides, the subdivisions recently introduced by Orange at Broadmoor have greatly improved conditions. First, the convicts are separated from the others, and those who have been indicted but not convicted. Finally, the ordinary prisoners who have been sentenced for short terms for crimes of little moment are returned to the country asylums. The government has carried the reform to completion and removed all inconveniences by setting aside one wing at the working prison for convicts who become insane while in prison. The statistics of asylums for the criminal insane show that they have a noticeably lower mortality rate than the general asylums. This is an encouragement to establish more of these institutions, at the same time proof that conditions in them are not as bad as has been represented. The expense does not appear to be so excessive when one compares with the cost of caring, not for ordinary insane persons, but for the violent insane, who, needing double watchfulness, occasion a considerable expense. It is necessary also to take into account the expenses occasioned by escapes, frequent in the case of the violent. In Massachusetts, this expense has been estimated at not less than $25 a day, while the escaped lunatic is at large. This is even one of the reasons that led the state to erect an asylum for the criminal insane. We may add that the expense could be considerably diminished by transferring to the asylum a number of the better penitentiary guards and advanced pay. In this way, the frequent changes of attendants would be avoided, and at the same time, men accustomed to this sort of danger and not easily intimidated would be secured. Finally, the number of inmates might be cut down by removing criminals who become inoffensive, by eliminating those who come from prison in an accurate state of insanity, and are therefore, as the experience of Gutch and Bruxelles shows, more likely to be cured, and also by retaining in the prison infirmary under strict surveillance those prisoners who are suspected of feigning insanity. End of section 29.